TalkRadio680.com.
21st Century Radio is sponsored by Hieronymus and Company. This is Talk Radio 680 WCBM. It's time now for award-winning 21st Century Radio. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
One world, one mind, one love. We will find on common ground. Peace will be found for all on earth.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. You're listening to Joanne Shenandoah, a dear friend of ours. Well, I'm your host I'm allegedly Dr. Bob Hieronymus, our executive producer and research assistant Laura Cordner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Before we introduce you to tonight's guest and his topic, here's a little update on the two major projects that we're working on. First, the Yellow Submarine's 50th birthday in America is in November 2018, and our Inside the Yellow Submarine Part 2 book will be in print by then. And we are also making excellent progress on the recreation of the Woodstock bus I created in 1968, which 50 years ago, that was about 50 years ago, and became an icon of the Woodstock event, and whose photos of it went viral worldwide, courtesy of the Associated Press, Life magazine, Rolling Stone, and so many other papers. We are hoping to complete this work by early October of 2018. We are working around the clock, 7 days a week, and I thank, and also sometimes thank all of you who, I've gotten so many invitations for dinners, lunches, breakfasts, etc., but there will be no time to celebrate until the bus and the book are finished and on the road touring America. You will be able to see how it was created courtesy of Arcadia in the films that will be shown worldwide, that will be 1 to 5 hours long. More on that as we progress. Our focus tonight is on the newly released Intertraditions International publication, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture. It is generally accepted that the Maori people arrived in New Zealand quite recently, sometime after 1200 AD. However, new evidence suggests that their culture is most likely centuries older, with roots that can be traced back to the archaic Gobekli Tepe site in Turkey, built around 10,000 BC. Now, it's a little bit changed there in time. Huh? The author of Decoding Maori, actually it's pronounced, I've been pronouncing it wrong for the last 50 years. It's called Decoding Maori's Cosmology, is Brother Laird Scranton. Laird Scranton is the author of a series of books on ancient cosmology and language, including The Science of the Dogon, Point of Origin, and China's Cosmological Prehistory. He has presented at conferences throughout the United States and is a frequent guest on Red Ice Radio and Coast to Coast AM. He lives in Albany, New York. Now, Gary A. David, author of Journey of the Serpent People, Hopi Migrations and Star Correlations, says of this book, listen to this carefully, clearly and skillfully demonstrates how these diverse peoples of long ago fully understood the fundamental principles of, listen to this, quantum physics and string theory. Now, this book is an essential piece of the puzzle showing the true picture of our ancient past. Now, speaking of New Zealand, let me say hello to our dear friends Richard Taylor and Tanya Rogers of What a Workshop in Wellington, New Zealand, who did all the special effects for Lord of the Rings and everything else who have joined us repeatedly on 21st Century Radio and gave us a very generous donation to our Kickstarter event that raised the funds to recreate the Woodstock bus. We'll be sending them a copy of Decoding Maori Cosmology, and Brother Laird Scranton has joined us, by the way, counting tonight, 5 times on 21st Century Radio over the past 32 years, which is about how long we've existed. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Laird.
Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me back on again.
I appreciate you more appreciating me than that. Whatever.
Do I get a 5-timers vest or anything, like they do on SNL?
Well, we don't usually have guests on that often. But over 32 years, this is the longest-running show on the paranormal. That's not just paranormal, but the new paradigm in the world. We didn't know that. We were told that just a little while ago. Now let's get to some questions about this important work. The focus of many of your books has been on ancient cultures from around 3000 BC and after. The Maori represent a much later culture, as we noted there, and thought to have arrived in New Zealand, I noted before 1200, but here it's 1100 AD. How did this affect your research?
Well, it was a different era to look at. Interestingly, I had originally intended to write the book on the Maori as my second book. After I had self-published the first book, Hidden Meanings, before it was picked up by Inner Traditions, I had realized that there were some compelling connections between the Maori and the Dogon, even though they are very far distant from each other. The Dogon are in Mali in northwest Africa, and the Maori are in New Zealand. But there are certain, what I call signatures of the tradition. These are elements that if a culture has them, you can presume they're part of the same tradition. I can give you some examples you'd be familiar with, like if they used a cubit as a unit of measure, they're probably connected. Mm-hmm. Or if they circumcise, they're probably connected.
That's interesting, yeah.
So the Maori had a concept of the po. For the Dogon, the po is described like an atom. And one of the features of these ancient concepts is that each term has a set of meanings, not just one meaning. And so when you find the same cluster or set of meanings associated with the same word in another culture, you have a lock on a correlation. So I could see, based on the concept of the po, that I was going to find things to write about the Maori.
Did any of that surprise you?
It did originally, because most of the traditions that I have been working with are from the era of around 3000 BC or before. Mm-hmm. And the Maori are a much later tradition and far distant. So I wouldn't have expected, just off the top of my head, to see connections from Africa or Egypt or India all the way out in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's possible that 10,000 BC?
Yeah, actually, the tradition that I'm studying, there are positive connections back to the Gobekli Tepe era in Turkey. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that site. I'm sure you've heard about it. Well,
certainly. I think you talked to us about that in the time. Of course, we've had a couple of other guests talking about it, too. It's just that just is an amazing situation. All of a sudden, before furthest back, most people were talking were 3,600 years. And bingo, 10,000 BC.
Right. Now, there are... the Gobekli Tepe site is a mountaintop site that has large standing stones set in circles. There are actually multiple stone circles there that were buried over for thousands of years, and there are beautiful carvings on these stones that were protected because they were buried. And a lot of those carvings are done in a particular style. A lot of them are laid sort of in low relief, with flat images of animals carved in a particular artistic style on the pillars. Mm-hmm. And the Dogon actually have a famous altar, a stone altar with carvings on it that is stylistically indistinguishable from what you see at Gobekli Tepe. So even the leap from 10,000 BC in Turkey to around 3,000 BC or so for the Dogon in Africa is a big leap.
Yeah, it sure is. How are you able to compare Maori practices, myths, and word meanings. You touched a little bit on that a minute ago, from so long ago.
Language is one of the big keys, and I'm fortunate that my entry point to these studies was through the Dogon, because the Dogon never adopted a written language. Theirs is an oral tradition, and the Dogon language is built on syllables that are symbolic. Each syllable represents things. Like if you go to ancient Egypt, you know that Ra is the name of the sun god. So if you hear the phonetic value Ra in another culture, like the Maori, you presume it connects to a sun god, and with the Maori it does connect to the concepts of the sun. The Dogon language is built on these syllables that each syllable represents what I call a root concept. And you can mix and match those concepts and build more complicated words. And when I went to the Maori language, I realized that simply from the sound of the word, the phonetics of the word, I could predict what the word meaning was going to be based on Dogon phonetics.
Oh, that's thrilling. That is. Yeah,
that's one of the big item pieces of how do you connect these things back and forth. Mm-hmm. There are numerous other ways of doing it, depending on the culture. You can do it through civic practices. You can do it through architectural forms. You can do it through naming conventions for sites and for example, the Dogon expert priests are called Hogan, and for the Maori they're called Tohunga. Back in archaic times they were called yoginis, and so you have some similar phonetics in there to give hints as to that these concepts might be related. Then you get down into now what was really the role of this person and how do they function in a village and things like that, and you can tie together clusters of connections that say these are likely to relate.
I know we shouldn't be spending too much time on Dogon, but I can't help it. I've always been, and you've joined us a couple of times talking about that, and that was a while ago. Could you just give us a minute or two more on the importance of the Dogon?
The Dogon are a modern-day African tribe. They're a primitive tribe as we look at them, meaning they live in mud huts and grow onions to eke out a living in a desert situation in northwest Africa, in Mali.
Amazing.
And they came to the attention of the world back in 1975 when Robert Temple wrote a book called The Sirius Mystery.
Yeah.
Wondering how is it that the Dogon knows certain things about astronomy that they really shouldn't be able to know without having access to powerful telescopes. For example, they knew that when you look at the bright star in the sky that's Sirius, that there's actually more than one star there. They knew that there was a bright sun-like star and a small, dark dwarf star, and they described these stars correctly. They know the correct orbital period for the two stars, and they know other details that science is still trying to confirm about the existence of a third body in that system. All sorts of interesting things that they know about that. They've actually pointed me in the past to structures, their myths and their symbolism has pointed me to structures that are so faint that you can't see them with the naked eye. I didn't know that there's a spiraling birthplace of stars that centers on the belt of Orion, but its light is so faint that you can't see it without time-lapse photography. Well, the Dogon knew it was there, and they pointed me to it.
Well, how did they cheat? They must have cheated somehow because they discovered this stuff before we did.
Yeah, well, we're also lucky that we have comparative traditions. We have more than one tradition to check back and forth what did they think. Mm-hmm. We have a very similar symbolic system in Buddhism connected to a very similar form of a ritual shrine, but given in a completely different language. But you get down to the modern day, and experts on Buddhism describe their symbolic system the same way that the Dogon experts on Dogon system describe them. We have comparability between the two. The Buddhists say that they learned all this science from somebody in ancient times who understood it. And that's also what the Dogon say. You get down to the details of that, and it gets more interesting than that, too.
Did they say exactly who that was that told them or introduced
Well, the Buddhists flatly say that their most sacred symbols came from a non-human source.
Uh-oh.
the Dogon say not only was it non-human, it was originally non-material, but acting in a material frame the same way that Moses meets God on the mountain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, this is just great stuff. I'm telling you. Do you ever felt like you were an archaeologist?
I sometimes feel like it. I don't actually get out in the field that often to look at things and down into the dirt.
Mm-hmm.
But these archaeologists go out for, some of them spend 30 years in the same place trying
Mm-hmm.
to gather information, and they write books and they write studies and so forth, hoping that somebody like me will come along and then leverage that information. Try to understand it and compare it to other things and make sense of what they've put down. And so that's really what my role has mostly been, is comparing things back and forth. How do the Buddhists understand this? How do the Kabbalists understand this? How did the ancient Egyptians understand it? How do the Dogon understand it? And then sort of triangulate in on what an original meaning must have been for a symbol or for a myth or for a practice.
Wow. There's a lot more I'd like to talk on about the Dogon, but we got to move on here. But you got to join us another time when we can just talk about them, because I suspect, if you don't mind my saying this, and you probably will, I suspect that in the previous lifetime you were doing similar work in this particular area.
Well, that could be. I personally don't have much of a sense of ever having a personal previous life, but as I joke that, at age 18, as I sort of came out of the box, I didn't feel like I had any connection to anything, any of this stuff, any of this symbolic information.
Well, I used to feel the same way at the age of 15. As a matter of fact, age of 15, I thought I knew everything there was to know. Amazing. Well, time out here on the playing field with our guest, Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the ancient origin of New Zealand's indigenous culture, published by our dear friends at Inner Traditions. Follow him on his active Facebook page. What I was surprised to learn when studying the Statue of Liberty? That liberty for real women is the key to humanity's survival on this planet. Truly. And also that Lady Liberty has Native American roots, and that America has reverence for the female half of divinity, or the goddess, at its very foundation. Powerful women and role models for balance are all part of our new book, The Secret Life of Lady Liberty, Goddess in the New World. It's a new way to understand America's history and future. Buy your copy today at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble, or from our website, secretlifeofladyliberty.com. That's secretlifeofladyliberty.com. Just chock full of all new reasons to love the United States of America.
Hello, this is Barry Marino, author of the Statue of Liberty Encyclopedia, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Well, we awarded Barry Marino, who is such an important person at that Statue of Liberty, a PhD. Excuse me. We sure did enjoy learning from him. Our guest is Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture, published by our dear friends at Inner Traditions. You can follow him on his active Facebook page. Laird, the Maori preserve a closely held esoteric tradition that shares many of the same attributes as those of the Dogon and ancient Egypt or India. Will you talk to us a little bit more about this, even though we touched on that last segment?
Sure, because to understand the Maori traditions and to try to have an understanding of how they trace forward, from my perspective, we start at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, southeast Turkey, at around 10,000 BC. From there, if we were talking about Egypt, we have three different paths of influence, which is partly why Egypt gets so complicated. We have a path that it looks like we have direct influences at 10,000 BC. That's how you get pyramids looking like they line up to the belt stars of Orion at 10,000 BC, and how you get a sphinx that looks like it's pointing to Leo at 10,000 BC. Then you have a second line of influence that passes down through the Fertile Crescent region and into India through a matriarchal cult called the Shakti cult. This is a group that was closely connected to the yoga tradition. Information was carried forward as an oral tradition through yoginis, who were female priests, basically. So we have influences that pass down through India and into Egypt in the south at Elephantine around 4,000 BC. And then we have a third line of influence that seems to pass down through the Fertile Crescent into Palestine and then jumps. We can actually track how it jumped by tracking the habitats of a particular kind of a mouse. Mice are surrogates for humans, but for archaeologists who are trying to track where people went, because the mice don't typically move very far distant from where the people are. So wherever you find the mice, you know you had people. So we can see there's a variety of mouse in Turkey that's a very close match for a mouse in northern Scotland on Orkney Island. And we can see, based on where it lives now, that it passed down into Palestine and then looks like it jumped by sea to the tip of northern Africa, and then seemingly jumped by sea to Orkney Island north of Scotland. And that tradition in northern Scotland preceded Egypt, dynastic Egypt, by about 100 years or so. And about 100 years after it, we see evidence of it on Orkney. We see agriculturally based kingships springing up in Egypt, in Ireland, in China, and in South America, all at about the same moment. So the path that I see for the Maori is that third path, based on references that survive in their language and in their practices and in the deities that they celebrate and so forth. It looks to me as if the Maori tradition passed down through the Fertile Crescent, down into Palestine, jumped to Orkney, and then around 2600 BC, that tradition was sort of forced out of Orkney for reasons we don't understand, down into the United Kingdom. And then there are traditions in Ireland that suggest it was forced out of Ireland. And from the Irish perspective, the tradition left across the Western Sea by boat. There are two myths in Ireland. One says it left by the Western Sea by boat. The other was that they left to the underworld. They departed to the underworld. You go to New Zealand, and you have traditions that are sort of mirror image that. The tradition is that the earliest inhabitants in New Zealand arrived by boat across the Eastern Sea, and an ancient name for New Zealand, the authority whose dictionary I'm working from, a gentleman by the name of Edward Tregear, who was an administrator in the government in New Zealand and developed the dictionary and did extensive research on the Maori. He says that the ancient name for New Zealand can also be interpreted to mean the first circle of the underworld. Oh. So the New Zealand myth is mirroring both myths in Ireland. You have all sorts of other connections between those two sites. So to really understand the Maori practices, you need to sort of selectively compare back to those other regions that it looks like it passed through to get there. A couple of researchers are confused about the Maori because they can see influences of the Tamil. I think there are artifacts that have survived in New Zealand that have writing from the Tamil, or the Dravidian languages of the Tamil in India. The Tamil are a group that still survive in India. But they have the evidence of the writing, but they don't have evidence of any of the later Hindu gods. They're saying, how can we have Hindu influences here if we don't have Hindu gods? Well, the reason is because, from my point of view, is because the tradition was influenced by India before Hinduism appeared. It passed out of that region and over to Orkney and then down in an era prior to when Hinduism existed. On Orkney, we have probably half a dozen different positive indicators to the Fertile Crescent region sometime after 6,000 BC. We have a type of mouse that looks like it's a match for the mouse I was talking about. We have a variety of barley that's been DNA tested and shown to have originated in the Fertile Crescent at 6,000 BC. We have a variety of sheep that originated in the same place. And we have a very odd burial tradition that has been poorly understood on Orkney that is a match for a burial tradition, a known burial tradition of the Shakti cult, the group that I said this passed through. A number of other connections also that are less distinct and that are less positively tested. So the easy answer is a group left the Fertile Crescent region sometime after 6,000 BC and arrived on Orkney by around 3,600 BC. And then the Maori descended from that, the Maori. So the pronunciation of the word is interesting because it comes down partly to whether you say it with an American accent or a New Zealand accent.
Oh, I didn't know. I don't know what...
There are vowel sound differences between how words are pronounced in New Zealand as opposed to us. As a matter of fact, there are really only two vowels that flip how they're pronounced, but it's enough to make the language almost unintelligible to someone who isn't aware of what those differences are.
Well, you see, I have serious problems along these lines because when I read books, some of these, I'm glad your book was not 700 pages like the last. It's a killer trying to get a book read in 1 week on 700 pages.
Yes.
But usually, I am not schooled in pronunciations, so I read all of these words that I really don't know very much for the first time, and obviously then I mispronounce them the rest of my life.
Well, I do too. You know, I make presentations. I'm working from an armchair here, so oftentimes I'm not aware of how the local group pronounces a word, and a lot of times there isn't just one pronunciation. If these are ancient words, there are differences of opinion about how they were pronounced.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up in Oregon, and in Oregon, they sell bumper stickers to put on cars that say O-R-Y-G-U-N, Oregon. Outsiders often pronounce it Oregon or Oregon.
Oh, I didn't.
There's a valley there called the Willamette Valley that outsiders tend to pronounce Willamette.
Well, it's not my fault that they do that, so you can't blame that on me. Now, I mean, that's one of the, not being a scholar, but just a student. I'll never probably rise above that, except in certain areas. We all have areas in which we stand out, and mine is American history and that kind of thing. Now, we have various methods, by the way, by which to trace the origins of the Maori cosmology, starting with features of their language. As you noted, you say the likely path of transmission begins at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey at about 10,000 BC. Why do you say that, and where does it go from there? Now, we touched a little bit more on that earlier.
Right. Really, my path of study, the geography of the books that I've written moves from Northwest Africa, then to Egypt, then to India and Tibet and China, then down into Turkey, then over to the United Kingdom, northern Scotland, and most recently on to the Maori in New Zealand. So I only, over time, started to get a sense of what the path of transmission of all this was, and there was effort that went into trying to make positive connections between these groups to demonstrate where it had gone. One of the things that helps is that the Dogon language is technically unclassifiable. And the reason it's unclassifiable is because the Dogon are, as a society, place a priority on preserving original forms, and that includes their words. Mm-hmm. And so their language is made up of very carefully separated segments of words that belong to, I think the estimate is now 19 different sub-languages.
Oh, my.
So when I do comparisons of ancient words, there are certain of these words, the majority of them tied to ancient Egyptian words, and so I have comparability between dictionaries there to check and see how much has the meaning of the Dogon word walked since ancient Egyptian times. I can compare the dictionaries. There are other Dogon words that are Tamil words, others that are ancient Turkish words, others that relate to an ancient language in the United Kingdom or in northern Scotland called Faroese language, and lots of commonalities to the Maori language. So the languages, the subsets of languages for the Dogon almost give us a way to trace the movements of the Dogon tribe, because they couldn't have Tamil words if they weren't in the region of India for a period of time.
Well,
and they couldn't have Turkish words if they weren't in the region of Turkey for a while.
When I'm going to, if something I know we don't have, we got to take a break here. But when we come back, a little aside here, secrecy and secret, there's so many misunderstandings on the internet and elsewhere, and the numerous battles that I used to go through with History Channel, Discovery Channel, National Geographic, which I will no longer do, mainly because they never give me a chance to talk about what I want to talk about. And then they have these other people on that say certain things that have really poor scholarship, and I never get a chance to debate them. They're gone before, and people, the American people, and wherever those shows go all over the world, are misinformed time and time again. That's one of the reasons why I don't want to continue to do any of those shows, because I hold them responsible for the kind of misunderstandings of what secret societies are like,
right? Especially,
too, that I've been a member of for half of my life, the Freemasonry, and actually co-masonry. Co-masonry is different than Freemasonry in the sense that both women and men. And boy, if you think men are good ritualizers, you should be with women, especially when they're older. Fantastic in all kinds of rituals. And they hold right to it perfectly. Men kind of elaborate a little bit, which is okay, but not the same. But we need to take our break here. That's going to be a finer break here on 21st Century Radio on this hour with our guest, Laird Scranton. We're talking about Decoding Maori Cosmology, the ancient origins of New Zealand's indigenous culture. Inner Traditions Publishing. Inner Traditions publishes some of the most fantastic books on the planet, but I'll say in the world. Follow him on his active Facebook page.
This is Carl Lehrberger, author of Secrets of Ancient America, www.newhistoryofamerica.com, and I invite you to continue listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, the ancient origins of New Zealand's indigenous culture. Oh, you talk about Edward Trieger, the author of Maori Polynesian Comparative Dictionary. I think you mentioned his name a little while ago. And his confusion that artifacts with Tamil writing on them have turned up in New Zealand, but that there are no ancient references to any of the Hindu gods. How can you explain this circumstance?
Right, and the path of transmission that I was talking about is really the compelling reason for me that the Maori tradition is benefiting from philosophies that are more ancient than Hinduism was in India. But because they happened earlier, we didn't see certain transitions. The transition in deity that we see happen at the Gobekli Tepe era, we have animals as direct icons of cosmological concepts. That's what the Dogon also preserve. The idea that, the twitching of a rabbit represents the concept of vibration, or the motion of a snake represents a concept of the way science represents the frequency of a vibration, that kind of thing. So at the Gobekli Tepe era, we have direct icon connection between the animals and the concept. You move on a little bit farther, and pretty soon the animals themselves have become deified. It's as if they're worshiping the animal, not the icon, and not using the icon as a way to remember a concept. Then you move a little bit farther, and you've got the icon reduced to an avatar of a deity who's been anthropomorphized in some ways, or initially, even like with Ganesha in Hinduism, you have a god who's half human and half animal, half elephant and half man, but with an avatar of a mouse. Then as you go on a little bit further, you get down to Greek and Roman times, you have fully anthropomorphized deities who are talked about as if they were human. You get to modern times with Christianity and Judaism and religions like that, where it's said that man was made in God's image. That's just the flip side way of saying that we're conceptualizing God as being human, as being anthropomorphized. So what we have with the Maori is something that is sort of a variation on all of that. Another factor of what happens in this tradition is that midway through the 12,000-year span of time, we have reversals in symbolism that we see across cultures. We see the obvious one is matriarchy, what's originally a feminine tradition, becoming masculine. It's supplanted by patriarchy. So you see goddesses in archaic times suddenly being sort of pushed out and gods moving in their place. In ancient Egypt, we actually have male and female versions of pretty much every deity. The male counterpart doesn't really show up until a relatively later era. By the time we get to Maori culture, we have a lot of the same deity archetypes represented, sometimes with names that are very similar, but with some interesting flips in gender going on. And we have situations where a deity is represented as being male, but a myth survives that says they were given as a bride to another male deity. So we have little hints at maybe the original representation was female and the concept got flipped. One of the things that always confused me was how is it that all these cultures all around the world at about the same era were flipping things the same way. The symbolism, a circle represented the earth for a period of time, and then suddenly a square represented the earth, and the circle was representing the sky or the non-material. How did they all know to do this? Well, my perspective now is, the metaphor that I use to help make it explainable is, imagine that you get on an airplane to fly across country. Now, you probably don't know anybody on the plane. You might not talk to more than one or two people when you're on the plane, but by the time you get to your destination, everybody knows to change their watch by 3 hours. It's not because they communicated it to each other. It's because they know how time zones work. And this instructed cosmological tradition is the same way. They know what symbolism is appropriate to which era, and they all flip it at the same time as we pass down through thousands of years. So in Maori culture, we end up with a sort of an odd mix of different elements from different regions. The Maori have memories of one of the things that typifies the Maori tradition were priestly schools where candidates for the priesthood were taught all the same subjects that I believe, based on Dogon references, were taught on Orkney Island. They were being taught agriculture. They were being taught astronomy. They were being taught basic geometry and mathematics. They were being taught things like civilizing skills, like how to domesticate animals and how to carve stone and things like that, metallurgy, how to weave cloth. Every village in Maori culture had a school associated with it. And those schools were patterned after a mythical school that was situated far to the east from where they are. Well, language and other references make it look as if they're talking about the ancient school that I said preceded ancient Egypt on Orkney Island in Scotland. There we have a series of megalithic structures that the researchers there really didn't know what to make of. They couldn't connect it to any tradition. But for me, having sort of an overview of cosmology, I could see that the structures represented a kind of an alphabet of stages of matter. You know, if you walked onto an island and found giant stones that were the letters A, B, C, D, and F, it wouldn't take a genius to figure out they were representing an English alphabet. Well, I started researching Orkney and realized that these structures are, in that same way, representative of a sequence of stages of how matter forms. It looks as if someone had set up on life-size scale that you can walk through all the stages of creation of matter, or many of the first stages of the creation of matter. I thought, this could hardly be anything but a place of instruction.
You know, it kind of reminds me of a theory concerning, say, for instance, our alphabet, A, B, C, D, etc., in which there's a story related to the alphabet, such as A is spirit triangle coming down on wings to the earth. B is the iota and the upper and lower circular elements of it is the oneness of the two. And C, say for instance, is the lunar or the moon. And it keeps going on so that you tell a whole story in there. And so that's why I've always been fascinated by various alphabets. As a matter of fact, I was trying to send you a little book on alien alphabets there. But but you've got so many books.
I think I could make room for one more, sure.
Oh, well, it's a very small one, and it's by a very, very dear friend of mine. I've been a collector of alleged, I have to say alleged because probably a good many of them aren't, alphabets that were allegedly alien. That to me is a very thrilling thing, to try to understand that and what kind of story that particular tells.
Yes,
so,
that would be very interesting to try to scope out.
Yes.
Always the trick is how can we find ways to positively anchor an idea that we have? You know, we see a resemblance. That's how all the interpretation starts, is with resemblances. But then somebody's got to find a way to pin it down and say it's more than just a resemblance. We can say this for a reason.
Well, since I really prefer to use the right side of my brain, which I don't get a chance to use anymore when you're reading 700-page books. But I just love that particular area. That's why I'm looking forward to returning to all of my work in the various arts. Because I can't do this program studying the arts. I mean, it doesn't work out that way. But there are, in the limit, we got about 4 minutes onto this hour. There are two major eras into the cosmological tradition, archaic and more recently ancient. Midway through the tradition, we see symbolic reversals, this is fascinating, that occur across culturally, such as the trend from matriarchy to patriarchy. Tell us, in this little bit of time, more about this and the trend from matriarchy to patriarchy that you've identified across cultures. What do you think led to this circumstance?
Well, those flips in symbolism help us categorize certain things. For example, we have ritual shrines in Buddhism and for the Dogon that are very close matches to each other. They begin with the same base plan that evokes a series of geometric shapes in a particular sequence, and with symbolism associated with what those shapes mean that it matches. And it's only at the final phase of implementation that the Dogon shrine culminates in a round base that sits on the earth, and the Buddhist shrine culminates in a square base that sits on the earth. Now, I know that a circle symbolically associates with the earth in archaic times, not modern times, not more ancient times. And a square represents the earth in more ancient times. So I can guess, simply by the way the shrine is implemented, that the Dogon form is a more archaic form than the Buddhist form.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, interestingly, with the Great Pyramid. It has a square base sitting on the earth. That means that whatever cycle, if we imagine that a cycle of eras like akin to the Yuga cycle that repeat, whatever cycle, however many cycles back the pyramids appeared, we can tell by the fact that it has a square base that it must have appeared in the second half of that cycle, not the first half.
That's fascinating because there are some pyramids that have circular bases.
Right, and anything with a circular base we know is archaic.
Yeah, well, I never realized how many pyramids there were on this planet, but there are thousands of all types. Oh, I'm being told I got to shut up, and we're going to have to take a break here with our guest, Laird Scranton, Decoding Maori Cosmology, The Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture, published by Inner Traditions. Oh, I got 30 seconds left. When we return, gosh, Rudy, I haven't used that term in 14 years. I wanted to touch on some of the Maori myths that we'll touch on them when we come back on 21st Century Radio.
And breaking news on Talk Radio 680 WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.